Welcome to the third panel of our Carnegie Global Dialogue series for 2021-2022. My name is Paul Haenle. I'm the director of Carnegie China, and I'm glad to be joined today by colleagues and friends Sheena Greetens, Tong Zhao, and William Chung to reflect on the first year of U.S. China relations under the Biden administration, the evolution of geopolitics in Asia, and the shifts underway as a result of the crisis in Ukraine. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our Carnegie Global Dialogue series, this is our 10th year hosting the series. We have done this normally in person, but with COVID, we've gone to do it virtually. It's basically a series of panel discussions which examine China's evolving foreign policy and international role from the perspective of Carnegie scholars and international experts at each of our 4 global centers and across the globe. And you'll be able to find replays of this dialogue and our previous Carnegie Dialogues on our China in the World podcast site, which is a series of discussions that I host with international experts from Carnegie China. Turning to today's discussion, I am delighted to introduce Dr. Sheena Greetens, Dr. Tong Zhao, and Dr. William Chung. Sheena Chestnut Greetens is an associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at University of Texas, Austin, as well as a faculty fellow with the Clements Center for National Security. She's also a distinguished scholar with the Strauss Center for International Security and Law. Her research focuses on East Asia, American national security, and authoritarian politics and foreign policy. She, in addition to her academic positions, is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and an adjunct fellow with the Korea chair at CSIS, and also has a position at the Fairbanks Center at Harvard, and is a member of the Digital Freedom Forum at the Center for New American Security. Her first book, Dictators and Their Secret Police, Coercive Institutions and State Violence, received the Best Book Award in 2017 from both the International Studies Association and the Comparative Democratization section the American Political Science Association. While it's not listed on her bio, but I learned it yesterday, Sheena is also a former student of the new Carnegie president, Tino Cuellar, during her undergraduate years at Stanford. And Tino also quite impressed with Sheena over the years. Dr. Tong Zhao is a senior fellow at Carnegie in the Nuclear Policy Program. He's also a resident scholar at Carnegie China in Beijing. We've been fortunate over the years to have Dr. Zhao as a frequent contributor and participant in our Carnegie Global Dialogues. It's good to have him back today. His research focuses on strategic security issues, including nuclear weapons policy, China's security and foreign policy. He serves on the board of directors of the Asia Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Nonproliferation and Disarmament. He's also on the advisory board of the Missile Dialogue Initiative. Previously, Tong Zhao was a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at Harvard University. And last but not least is William Chung, is a senior fellow at the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies, a Yusof Ishak Institute here in Singapore, where I am as well. He is also managing director at Fulcrum, which is the Institute's commentary website focused on Greater Southeast Asia. Previously, he was with IISS here in Singapore, which everyone knows puts on the Shangri-La Dialogue each year. William was the Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Asia Pacific Security. And in that capacity, he helped to run the annual IISS Shangri-La Dialogue. William was formerly a senior writer at the Straits Times, where he wrote regular columns on defense and security issues. His focus at the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies is on Asia Pacific security issues and great power relations in the Asia Pacific. So thank you to all 3 of you for joining our panel today. Before we kick off the discussion, let me just quickly go through a couple housekeeping items. First, we would like to give the audience an opportunity to ask questions during the discussion. And so if you're listening in and you'd like to submit a question, please use the chat function on YouTube. Second, we'll be posting a recording of this discussion as an episode in our China in the World podcast, and you can find that on our website. And with that, we'll kick things off. So just over a year ago, President Biden assumed office, yet U.S.-China relations still remain quite on edge. Presidents Xi and Biden have met twice now in virtual meetings, first in mid-November 2021, and then again last week. There's been high-level meetings in Anchorage, Alaska, and Tianjin, in Rome last week, of course, between Jake Sullivan and Yang Jiechi. Few, if any, breakthroughs have been achieved on the broad range of differences between the US and China. Relations deteriorated considerably over the last several years and have yet to recover since Biden has assumed office. Strategic competition has intensified. Critical areas of tension, including over trade, technology, security issues, differences over human rights, all remain high. Interestingly, the 50th anniversary of President Nixon's historic visit to Beijing came and went last month. And we recall, of course, the efforts of President Nixon attempting to exploit the intensifying rivalry between China and the Soviet Union, reached out to Chairman Mao to form a new and strategic partnership, really, between the US and China, and in the process, putting more pressure on the Soviet Union in the midst of the Cold War. President Nixon in 1972, in February, his visit was called the week that changed the world, given the geopolitical shifts that drove the course of history for the next half a century. 50 years on, of course, the situation looks very different. Today, it is China and Russia that have developed quite strong ties, developed largely for strategic reasons. And the relations they have with each other is, of course, much stronger today than the relationship the United States has with each of them. On February 4th, Chinese and Russian leaders, President Putin and President Xi, announced a no-limits strategic partnership during a visit by Vladimir Putin to Beijing to attend China's Olympics. And less than 3 weeks later, Vladimir Putin invaded without provocation the sovereign nation of Ukraine. Many have argued that this new China-Russia no-limit strategic partnership is now being put to the test. The United States, Europe, many other countries have responded to Russia's aggression with political resolve, responded with robust, significant economic sanctions, supported by many nations, including many in the Asia Pacific. Hundreds of private and multinational companies have curtailed or ended their business with Russian market, with Russian companies. All of this, of course, in support of the sovereignty of national borders and the right of people to freely choose their government. As we opened this session, President Biden, I noticed as I was watching the TV before we started, is boarding Air Force One to attend an emergency NATO summit amid the war in Ukraine. China has taken a different approach, seemingly trying to straddle between a number of different goals. On one hand, supporting its strategic partnership with Russia. On the other hand, wanting to maintain adherence to its stated principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-interference. And at the same time, trying to limit any further damage to its relations with the United States and with Europe. It's been a difficult balancing act. China has said it's against the war in Ukraine. It is not in China's interest, but it is yet to condemn Russia for its actions in Ukraine. And senior US officials argue that China, instead of straddling, should instead use its influence with President Putin to defend international rules and the principles that China professes to support. And Washington now is concerned over reports that Beijing may provide Moscow with military assistance or help to alleviate the sting of the economic sanctions. So 50 years after Nixon's visit to China, U.S.-China relations finds itself at an inflection point. And today we'll examine all of these issues and many more through the perspectives of experts in the United States, Beijing, and Singapore. So let's get started. Sheena, I want to start with you. Last year, when we had our Carnegie Global Dialogue on U.S.-China, we assessed the potential impact of the incoming Biden administration on U.S.-China policy. And at the time, some in China were hoping for a reset in relations. Now, and at the time, I think most in the U.S. said a reset really wasn't in the cards, but there was an expectation that the Biden team would not continue with the same approach of the Trump administration. But as it stands today, you hear from a number of scholars that the Biden administration's approach has more continuity than it does change. And I wanted to start with you by asking, after more than a year in office, how do you assess the Biden administration's approach to China? And what, in your view, have they done well, and where have they fallen short?
Yeah, it's a great question now that we're a little more than a year in. Broadly speaking, I would agree with the assessment that there's been more continuity than change. And that, if you had asked me perhaps a year ago or 18 months ago, I might have expected the balance to be a little bit further on the spectrum toward change. What we've seen just is a fair amount, I think, of stasis on China policy. I actually think a lot of that has to do with some lock-in effects that the Biden team is getting from some of their other choices about their Indo-Pacific policy and Indo-Pacific strategy. So I don't want to preempt and jump straight to the regional context, right. But I actually do think that that's in some ways the China policy is derived from or being affected and constrained by some of the choices and prioritization of the Indo-Pacific strategy and the administration's choices about some of that. But I think regardless, what we've seen is, I guess, especially when it comes to the bilateral relationship, more, I think, public friction. Even if we didn't necessarily expect to see, a lot of progress or a real change or U-turn in course. I've been surprised, to be honest, sometimes how confrontational the public rhetoric has been, particularly the conversation in Anchorage, and then this latest decision immediately after the phone call between President Biden and President Xi. There's this report about the visas of Chinese officials, which seems like it doesn't give very much time for either side to follow through on whatever, in the Xi-Biden phone call, there was this discussion of having their respective teams being tasked to do some follow-up. And if 4 days later you do something else on visas for officials that has an impact on, those teams' ability to do their jobs, it seems like you're kind of shortcutting your own process. And I don't know for sure what the thinking was or what the process was there, but I've been a little bit surprised that some of the friction has been so public. I might have expected tense conversations in private and a little bit less public aspect to some of the tensions, but there's been that's been quite noticeable in the public realm, I think, and that's been one of the bigger surprises. I'll stop there and maybe we can talk about the regional strategy.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I want just one follow-up before I turn to Dr. Tong Zhao and get a perspective from China. But we talk a lot about, of course, President Biden's approach to China. China, of course, has agency as well in the relationship and can either take steps and adopt policies that either help to put the relationship on more solid footing or create additional frictions. How do you see China's approach to the relationship? I mean, the message has been pretty clear. The downturn in relations, at least according to Chinese leaders, is the fault of the Trump administration. And it's up to the Biden administration to untie the knot. And China will basically sit back and wait until that happens. Has it surprised you that China has taken this kind of an approach? And how otherwise do you assess the Chinese approach to the U.S.?
Yeah, I don't know that it surprised me necessarily, but I don't think it's likely to be productive in that it just doesn't strike me that this is an area where that's going to yield a lot of productive results. And, there are areas where sort of putting the responsibility or the onus on the United States might make more sense, or it might make sense again to have a discussion about, some of the choices that both sides made under a previous administration. But, there are also clearly cases where China's choices are generating some pretty significant long-term effects, not just with the US, but other partners in the region. And so absent a change in some of the underlying behaviors that are generating concern in the US and globally, I think it's unwise to expect that recalibration will occur with no meaningful change in behavior on Beijing's part. So, surprising or not, it just seems unrealistic for the PRC to be expecting the kind of recalibration that maybe they hoped for without a little more proactive change in behavior on their part.
Thank you for that. Tongjia, I want to turn to you. What's your sense on the view from China broadly around the Biden administration's China policy?
I think the mainstream Chinese view, especially within the Chinese expert community, is that Biden administration's policy represents a quantitative adjustment, not a qualitative change compared with the Trump era policy. It's in a lot of sense, it's a continuation of Trump policy, which reflects a consensus of some sort in DC. That said, apparently, Biden administration appears to be more competent in many issue areas. It is able to build back US-led alliance and relying on allies and friends for long-term competition with China, which could present a more strategic threat to China in the long run. But I think there is also this growing agreement that actually the two sides are moving closer in some, at the strategic level. They both agree they need to make more efforts to stabilize the bilateral relationship, even though China doesn't like the term of building guardrails to the relationship. But in essence, I think China shares that importance, which was reflected in the discussion in the two presidents' first virtual summit meeting in November last year. I think China feels a little frustrated afterwards about perceived US dragging feet on respecting China's core interests, including Taiwan, Xinjiang, and other issues. China is very concerned about continued, perceived American continued effort to conduct the ideological competition. With that all said, I still think from the Chinese perspective, US-China bilateral relationship is still very much at the top of Chinese diplomatic agenda. And its importance is only increased by the current Ukraine war. Many Chinese experts perceive an opportunity to use, to further stabilize and maybe even improve relationship with the United States in the aftermath of the Ukraine war. Chinese ambassador to U.S. made some important efforts in Washington. The current domestic difficulties faced by Chinese leaders also, I think, make China more interested in moving things in that direction.
John, you make some very interesting comments. You've mentioned guardrails and efforts on both sides to try to bring stability and general improvements to the relationship. When President Biden and President Xi met in November, President Biden raised this idea of strategic stability talks between the US and China. How have those been received in China? And has there been any progress in your understanding between the two countries in developing such a mechanism, or any discussions about how such a mechanism might be implemented? Because it seems to go right at the core of what you're saying about the need to provide greater strategic stability between the United States and China.
I think it's certainly a very positive signal from Washington that President Biden was willing to discuss strategic stability. That was something that China really desired, really wanted from the United States. But it may be offered a little too late because China has appeared to reach the conclusion that the US is too reluctant to accept a mutual nuclear vulnerability relationship with China, to and use that as a strategic reassurance that U.S. would accept peaceful coexistence with China. So China waited for a long time and basically, I think, reached the conclusion that we have to build up our own material power, including nuclear power, to make the United States accept the reality and accept peaceful coexistence. So in some sense, the horse has left the barn. And when China is investing so much in its strategic military capabilities, technologies, I think there is no longer that strong interest in discussing nuclear arms control or other measures that would build a stable strategic military relationship. The feeling here is competition is inevitable, and we have to rely on our own power to make the United States accept reality. But there is certainly continuing effort in Washington to propose concrete options to China to stabilize the nuclear relationship and maybe contain or at least mitigate the emerging arms race. Maybe start with easier steps, low-hanging fruits, transparency measures, confidence building measures, rather than very challenging arms control topics. Hopefully, those this flexible approach taken by the Biden administration could make China more willing to engage. But we need to wait and see what specific proposals the Biden team will come up with.
Thank you for that. But for now, no movement on this proposal for strategic stability talks for the reasons that you've described. William,
very little.
Let me turn to you from your vantage point in Southeast Asia. How do you view the Biden administration's policy toward China over the first year plus? What have you observed in terms of changes, and where have you seen continuity?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Again, thanks for having me. Having sat in Singapore, which is like a vantage point in the region, kind of listening post, if you like, of how we see Sino-American relations, I think I do agree with Sheena and Tong Zhao that there's more continuity than change. I think what we can say about the Biden administration 12 months in, it's probably replication of a Trump strategy with adjustments at the margins, but with a friendlier face. I mean, so if you look at it at the macro level, the second Biden year in the White House has begun. There's still a raft of U.S. sanctions on China. There are still U.S. and allied ships, roaming up and down the South China Sea. There are sanctions on China for human rights violations, restrictions on technology and investment, and of course now we have Ukraine. So I mean, this analogy, this image came out to me when Sheena was talking. I mean, imagine if America and China were like two heavyweight sumo wrestlers, right? Who are, in a deadlock, right? Yeah, arm lock. We've seen that since 2017, when President Trump came into power. Nothing much has really changed, simply because, at the domestic level, positions have hardened, right? We're seeing growing bipartisanship in the United States against China, the threat of China. On the Chinese side, we've seen the CCP going, harder than hardline when it comes to being pushed by the United States. And one of the factors is that China feels that it's arrived, it's arrived as at least, in the region, in Asia and the Indo-Pacific, if not, reaching to other parts of the world. So we have these two sumo wrestlers who are locked, in an arm lock. And this has been happening for some years. And what I mean, not that I'm a sumo exponent or anything, but to find vulnerabilities, to find weak points, you probe, either you grab your opponent's tongue, or you grab his tie, or or other parts that I should not mention in polite conversation. But what I'm trying to say is that both China and the United States are trying to probe different parts of the region for weakness, and we've seen it in the Republic of Korea over the TART issue several years ago. We've seen it in Japan, and of course we've seen it in Australia. The Chinese are putting on a lot of pressure on Canberra, Australia, for its request to have an investigation onto the origins of COVID. And of course, Southeast Asia, where I'm at, I do believe that if the US really wants to gain traction in that competition with the Chinese, you've got to win friends and influence people. And the place that you need to win friends and influence people is in Southeast Asia, simply because of the growing geostrategic weight that Southeast Asia represents, and the fact that most Southeast Asian countries are not aligned, to either China or the United States, save for a very small number. Yeah.
Thank you for that. These analogies coming from Singapore. I know two sumo wrestlers. I think it was your founding premier Lee Kuan Yew that talked about two elephants fighting in the region. So it's either sumo wrestlers or elephants. Just as a follow-up to you, the White House and China mentioned released its Indo-Pacific strategy last month. And I wanted to get your perspective from Southeast Asia, how that was perceived in the region. What were the strengths and where were the weaknesses?
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for that question. There's a phrase, beware of Greeks bearing gifts. I think from my vantage point in Southeast Asia, I think Southeast Asians are they have an allergic reaction when there are external powers, especially if they are major powers, coming to their backyard and telling them, what their vision of the region should be. So in a sense, I think the Indo-Pacific strategy was well crafted, is well articulated. There are a lot of statements inside that very few Southeast Asian countries will have contentions with. I mean, we're talking about prosperity, we're talking about connectivity, we're talking about freedom of the global commons. We're talking about open and free societies, governance. I can't find, at least in public, any Southeast Asian official who have any problems with the principles that I mentioned there. And back to your question, Paul, I think the strength of the Indo-Pacific strategy is that it's a strategy that is not directed at a particular country, and it is. I think the trick has been learned. The four countries that are behind the Indo-Pacific strategy: Japan, Australia, India, and United States. What they do is that they lay out principles, but they do not actually say, which country this strategy is directed at, and we do know who that country is, but it's not mentioned. Even if you look at the Indo-Pacific strategy document that was released in February, or the Quad statements that were released in recent months, there's no mention of China whatsoever. So in a sense, that's clever. But what I think a weakness in the Indo-Pacific strategy, it goes back to the point that I raised earlier, Paul, which is that you need buy-in. You need buy-in from the smaller countries, smaller states in the Indo-Pacific, and buy-in has to come from Southeast Asia. And the very fact that ASEAN has released its own ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, that was sometime in 2019. I think it was a backhanded push. It was an indirect push at the Indo-Pacific strategy, simply because if you drill down to the details of the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, it was even more anodyne than the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. It talked about, maritime security. It talked about connectivity. It talked about trade. Basically, everything that comes from the ASEAN playbook in terms of diplomatic terms. But the clever move behind the AOIP is that ASEAN wanted to put its own imprimatur on Indo-Pacific strategy, while putting a lot of taking away a lot of the power of the US-led Indo-Pacific strategy when it comes to being directed at China. And in this sense, if you don't have buy-in from ASEAN member states, the US Indo-Pacific strategy really has its work cut out for it, because you can't have an Indo-Pacific strategy without support from smaller countries in the region.
Thank you. I want to turn to both Tongzhao and Sheena on this Indo-Pacific strategy. Why don't I start with Tongzhao? You heard William say one of the strengths was that the Indo-Pacific strategy was not directed at any particular country. Was it viewed that way from China? How was it seen from China?
I think Chinese experts notice the US efforts to avoid directly making China the focus of the Indo-Pacific strategy. But there is no doubt in the mind of Chinese experts and officials that they believe China is, the priority, and the U.S. is simply, trying to avoid mentioning it at the rhetorical level. It is clear to Chinese experts that the U.S. now sees China as its most important long-term strategic rival, and U.S. Through this Indo-Pacific strategy is preparing for long-term competition and maybe even for eventual contest. China is deeply unhappy about continued U.S. efforts in this strategy to, focus on ideological issues, focus on military alliances. But even when U.S. makes efforts to also, discuss non-security issues, technology, supply chains, or non-traditional security issues, China sees threat at every in every aspect of this as a long-term effort to compete. But China also understands this strategy report does not necessarily reflect the newest American thinking and debate on these issues because of what is happening in the world today in the aftermath of the Korean War. But I think for China questions how much of this current version of strategy is sustainable, because the U.S. still faces major constraints in its resources. China also thinks this region has a lot of complexity, and China has a lot of flexibility and maneuverability to further readjust its own diplomacy in response to the American strategy. And China will continue growing, which means China will have more leverage and will have more influence. And after what is going on in Ukraine, I think China feels there is even more room for China to maneuver in order to focus its efforts on influencing the global South. In this region, that means countries like India, ASEAN members, the Pacific Island countries, and even South Asian countries, etc. So China also feels, I think, a little more confident today that there is more room for it to fine-tune its policy in order to counter American Indo-Pacific, which also emphasizes on building on alliances and partnerships. So in some sense, China is using the same playbook to counter the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy.
Sheena, let me turn to you. I want to get your perspectives on the Indo-Pacific strategy, but also want to ask you, many in the region, since I've been out here for the last 6 months, I hear this often, but also in the US, argue the strategy relies too much on security and not enough on the economic side. We've heard about the Indo-Pacific economic framework, but there hasn't been a lot of details around what it will entail. And so in addition to your general views and just the strengths of the Indo-Pacific strategy, what's your view on the economic piece of that?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question, and actually is folded into my answer about the overall Indo-Pacific strategy. First of all, I would note that although this is the Indo-Pacific strategy, my understanding is there's also a separate China strategy. And while I understand the reason for doing the two separately, it is a little bit hard I think, to read the Indo-Pacific strategy knowing that there's another strategy piece that will have big implications for Asia coming, but not having had the two documents side by side to compare. So I just want to note right now, I think we have a little bit of imbalanced information about the written approach and thinking of the administration. And so what I'm about to say may be subject to change once we have a few more of these strategy documents on the table. I think my concerns about the Indo-Pacific strategy are by and large not to do with what's in the text in the document. I think it hits a lot of the right notes. It, has very strong emphasis on allies and partners. It does move away from this sort of black and white democracy autocracy framing, which is probably helpful in a region that is really heterogeneous in terms of regime type, right? Where democracy is not the kind of unifying message that you see, for example, in Europe around what's happening in Ukraine. And so I think the strategy is realistic. The vision it outlines is realistic and effective. My problems or my concerns about it really have to do with implementation. It's not clear that there's a match between the written strategy and the resources needed to implement it. And I think that's especially acute in the economic realm, but not actually limited to it. So, even on things like the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, there's been a lot of questions about whether or not the budgets and the sort of concrete decisions that the Pentagon is making or the things it's asking Congress for actually match what the United States is trying to do, even in the security realm, right? I already mentioned that the Biden administration, I think, by my sort of read as an outsider, has struggled a bit because they were so strong on democracy rhetorically out of the gate. And yet the key region that they've identified as a strategic challenge, they've got to get buy-in from allies and partners that are not all democracies and or not liberal democracies of the type that their rhetoric emphasizes. And so if you can't use that as a unifying message, then the tasks of diplomacy, and I do think we've seen some real positive steps, vaccines, tech cooperation, some very concrete governance-focused, performance-focused efforts that are of interest to a broad range of countries in the region. So from the standpoint of where I sit in the United States, those all seem like positive, realistic shifts. But, and this gets to your second question, honestly, the sort of glaring weakness on implementation will continue to be the lack of detail and the lack of a positive economic agenda. We sometimes say about other countries to watch what they say, not what they do. And that goes for us as well, right? And if I was sitting, almost anywhere in Asia right now, I would look at the United States and say, the domestic politics seems so difficult for the administration to overcome that I don't see the things that really, are driving economic integration in the region as things that the United States is going to be able to come in and fully participate in, let alone lead on, right? So there is economic integration and progress happening in the region, but it's happening largely with the United States on the sidelines. And so I think, in terms of U.S. strategy, right, there's separate questions about regional outcomes and regional economic frameworks and development and stability and growth. But in terms of that, from a U.S. strategy standpoint, I think that it's just going to continue to really handicap the administration.
Thank you for that. Just one quick follow-up on the domestic politics around the trade issue. I hear that, and I often, tell people myself that it appears that domestic politics is too daunting for the United States to be able to enter in or even consider some type of multilateral trade agreement. Many in the region, of course, would be delighted to find the United States back in the CPTPP game, but people say the domestic politics is too tough. On the other hand, people say, roughly 80% of Democrats support free trade. Republicans, obviously less, although I would say historically the Republicans have been supportive of free trade. What is the sticking point in terms of domestic politics in your mind? Is that really an issue that will prevent any forward movement on multilateral trade arrangements in the future?
I don't think it's inevitable that it would block the administration if they chose to really invest a lot of political capital. But I think the reality is that it would take enough political capital and probably a little bit more unity from the administration on what the strategy is and how they engage with Congress in particular. We've seen reports, and I don't have any inside view into this necessarily, but we've seen reports of some pretty intense disagreements between USTR and the NSC. And what you'd ideally want for American strategy writ large is for those two groups to be very closely coordinated and to be able to present a unified message to Congress about how to manage both the administration's agenda, the specific policies it wants to promote, and also then a willingness to articulate and work with Congress on whatever the domestic costs are, both generally and to particular members that they need to build the coalition to get the policy through. Again, it's not, I don't think that it's fair to say that it's impossible, but I think the administration would have to coordinate within the executive branch a little bit more than it sounds like or looks like they're doing, and frankly probably also be willing to expend other domestic capital. I'm not a domestic politics person, but it just seems to me like, in a week when we're also looking at a Supreme Court nomination play out in the Senate, that the administration just has not chosen to put its political capital toward that particular outcome yet. And I don't know whether it will, but I think that's an open question, not a foregone conclusion.
Thank you for that. You have all, in your openings in talking about the broad relationship, have mentioned Ukraine a number of times. And, obviously I get the sense from all of you that, in a sense, depending on what happens with regard to the conflict in Ukraine, it has the potential to set the U.S.-China relationship on a very different trajectory. And so I think it's important that we delve into this, because I know that this issue obviously has grabbed the world's attention, and it's caused additional strains in U.S.-China. Let me first, if I could, turn to Tongjia. China appears, from a U.S. perspective, kind of stuck between two mutually exclusive positions. One, on one hand, supporting its strategic partner with Russia. On the other hand, maintaining its stated support for sovereignty and territorial integrity. We hear China does not want to abandon Russia. Moscow is one of Beijing's most important strategic partners, but it also does not want to abandon these long-held principles: sovereignty, non-interference. How do you assess China's strategic dilemma here? What choices does it have in dealing with the Ukraine crisis? And how, in your view, has it handled those choices to date?
Well, thank you, Paul. I think one of my, I have this deep impression that this war is increasing China's overall concern about United States. Because China has a very different understanding about the nature of the war and the American role in the war. China genuinely, I think, blames the United States and NATO for causing the war. And after the war started, China believes that what it saw is a joint and coordinated U.S. effort with its Western allies to strangulate Russia using all sorts of illegal measures including crippling sanctions, diplomatic isolation, political demonization, simply because Russia sought to defend its legitimate interests. So I think this reinforces many Chinese strategists' previous belief that the U.S. is, the ultimate black hand behind all of this, because the U.S. is inherently hegemonic, and that's embedded in American strategic culture. And U.S. embraces inherent biases against different political systems like those in Russia and China. So this only strengthens, I think, the existing power-centric mindset in China, and will motivate China to focus on building its material power and prepare for the eventual contest with the United States. And from this context, China, I think, believe that Russia's importance as China's strategic partner is even more salient. In eventual contest with the United States, only Russia can provide China with critical support. So I think that makes China even less likely to give up or to undermine its partnership with Russia in order to please the United States and other Western countries. And by the way, China is really emphasizing on its humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, but observers have pointed out that maybe to avoid antagonizing Russia, China is only providing in the latest round more than $1 million of humanitarian aid, which is about 1.5 apartments in Beijing, the cost of 1.5 apartments in Beijing. So that it looks like the U.S. is making efforts to sharpen Chinese choice, but China does not really appreciate it. China still wants to balance all its strategic interests, wanting to preserve partnership with Russia, but still, at the same time, stabilize relationship with the United States. There is still a lot of internal debate in the experts community about how to do so. But given this dilemma China is in, I think there are real limits on how much China can achieve in balancing these interests, and especially in stabilizing relationship with the United States. China may end up having a worse relationship with the United States, including the increased Chinese belief in the importance of achieving self-reliance and autarky in strategic, economic, and technological areas will work against China's goal to maintain its access to US technologies and markets. So this internal tension in China's own geoeconomic strategy will also become more salient. And this dilemma, I think this tension also limits how much China can really contribute to mediating the war in Ukraine. So all of these limits, I think, are real, and we may end up squandering this opportunity of improving China's relationship with the United States.
Thank you for that, Tongjia. Very helpful description of how China sees this. I want to turn to China. We heard Ambassador Qin Gang was on Face the Nation this past weekend, and you can hear some of the messages from him and other officials now saying basically they're against the war in Ukraine. It's not in China's interest. They're against the use of force of any sovereign state. Chinese officials claim China has a strategic partnership with both Russia and Ukraine. So it's not in its interest to see two friends at war, but China and that China will not take a side. It stands for peace and help in whatever way it can to promote a peaceful resolution. Is that how it is perceived in the United States? Is it perceived that China is balancing and that as a result, it's maintaining influence with Russia, with Ukraine, and open channels of communication to the US and Europe in a way that positions China to be helpful with regard to bringing the conflict to a close and hopefully restoring Ukraine's sovereignty. How is this seen from the United States?
Yeah, to be honest, I think from the United States, it's seen as a pretty clear lean toward Moscow on Beijing's part. And I think that's true for a couple of reasons. Chinese rhetoric from diplomats and officials has really emphasized the United States and NATO as the culprit or the instigator of the conflict. Which is not a framing I think that the United States or much of Europe is willing to accept. And so there's just a sort of fundamental difference of attribution from the beginning that I think constrains how much common ground can be found. The other reason is that, if you look at a couple of different realms, diplomatic, economic, and military, there's this open question that American and administration sources have raised about a reported request from Russia for military aid from China. That just seems to be kind of a question mark right now. We don't know what was discussed. We see a lot of heterogeneity in the economic space where banks and corporations are to a certain extent complying with the sanctions and but also choosing to jump in and capitalize on market opportunities in cases like Union Pay, where Western withdrawal creates an opportunity for China to benefit, or a Chinese entity to benefit economically. So there's a lot of heterogeneity in the economic space. But diplomatically, the rhetoric's been very consistent. Like I said, this is a United States NATO instigator culprit framing that's been very consistent. There's been this amplification of some of the Russian disinformation claims about Ukraine and biolabs. And I guess the point I wanted to emphasize about that is that in contrast to some other cases where the rhetoric is kind of mere rhetoric, these talking points are mere rhetoric, this is a conflict in which information and information strategy has really so far played a pretty major role in shaping outcomes on the battlefield and the realignment of geopolitics around this crisis. And so I think to sort of treat the information dimension and the diplomatic signaling as sort of normal when they've played a heightened role in this conflict overall would be a mistake. I see China's choices about rhetoric and information to have been more significant than they might be in some other crises. And on that dimension, the sort of, clear, consistent, I would say fairly ardent support for Russia's position has been pretty clear. And frankly, that's also been reflected in some important international institutions. Right. There were 2 early abstentions at the UN, but as the conflict has unfolded, we've seen China willing to isolate itself in international institutions like the IAEA and the ICJ in order to back China. And that those have been the sort of more recent votes. So I think, we have to take that dimension pretty seriously. And despite my previous watch what people do or watch what countries do, not what they say, in this particular case, I think there's an asterisk there because of the overall importance of information strategy and because that's actually been reflected in some of China's votes in international organizations. So that's my sort of basic take on how it's being perceived in Washington. And I think the other factor is, while we've seen other actors sort of get involved in active mediation, whether that's the right way to mediate, I will sort of bracket for a moment, but we've seen, Israel, a number of European leaders, visibly working the phones, getting on planes, having these conversations, whereas China will say, well, we hope to see this, or we'd like to see this, but there's not a lot of visible activity to concretely, try to create a pathway for de-escalation. Maybe that's happening behind closed doors, but for the rest of the world and global publics watching, it doesn't appear that China's rhetoric about the importance of a diplomatic solution and de-escalation has been entirely followed through by action. And so again, what that does is leave a premium on some of these rhetorical and informational and diplomatic choices that have really put China's weight behind Russia.
Thank you for that. William, I'm going to come to you next, but I want to go back to Tong Zhao just to respond with some of what Sheena has said. Tong Zhao, you heard Sheena talk about the perception in the US of a pretty hard lean toward Moscow. And then this doesn't contradict what you said, frankly. I mean, you mentioned that China's working hard not to undermine its partnership with Russia. But this is in stark contrast to the way China handled Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008 and Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. And I want to get a sense from you why you think there's a difference this time. And secondly, Sheena mentioned this concern about China potentially backfilling sanctions or even providing Russia with military weapons, which came out prior to the meeting between Jake Sullivan and Yang Jiechi. And I want to get a sense from you how you think China what kind of economic support do you think China would provide? What kind of support will it avoid? And what about that very important question of military aid? Because many have said military aid could be a geopolitical game changer.
Well, thank you, Paul. That's a great question. Why China has hardened its position in becoming even more sympathetic to Russia? I think one reason is the current Ukraine war is a little unique. The way that Russia is invading Ukraine against the joint pushback from Ukraine and Western countries makes many Chinese people, including experts, seeing it from the perspective of a future potential Chinese military operation against Taiwan. The reason many Chinese people and experts they support Russia, they want Russian troops to win, is because they want to see Chinese military victory over Taiwan in a future similar scenario. So they see themselves in a similar position as Russia. I think another reason is over the years there is a growing trend that because of this information gap and because of increasingly stronger national narratives in China that promote a stronger China-Russia partnership and being very critical against U.S. and NATO, I do believe this information environment, this strong national narrative, over time have a very important impact, shaping and influencing general public opinion and including the perspectives of experts. We do see a very strong sentiment today that people genuinely believe, including senior policy experts, they genuinely believe that U.S. strategic culture is inherently hegemonic. The U.S. is willing to use all illegal measures. The U.S. is willing to violate all sorts of international norms and laws and principles simply to achieve its narrow and selfish geopolitical interests. So the perception that there is something inherently evil in the U.S. strategic intent, I think is influencing how Chinese experts look at Russia, look at U.S. role in this war. Regarding your question of whether China would provide military support to Russia, given what is already revealed now, I think what might have been happening is China was in discussions with Russia about potential, bilateral military trade and arms sales, not necessarily as an urgent emergency measure to help Russia win the war in Ukraine, but as part of a regular bilateral discussion on arms trade. maybe Russia sees it as helpful to its operation in Ukraine, but China thinks this is part of regular thing, so it shouldn't be that sensitive. But I do believe that the U.S. Explicitly calling out China on this, putting a lot of international pressure attention on this, will make China behave very carefully. So I wouldn't think China would go ahead and blatantly support important military equipment, because that would fundamentally damage China's relationship with the United States and many European countries.
Thank you, Tongzhao. You've talked previously, and I think it's an important point about the growing information gap between where Chinese, not just average citizens, but experts are getting their information, and where others in the U.S. and elsewhere are getting their information, and that there's a much stronger nationalist sentiment and narrative, and that this is having a significant impact. And I've heard you make that point before, and it's a very important one. William, I want to turn to you. You recently, and I'd encourage folks to read this, did an insightful piece on the differing responses in ASEAN to the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine. You described Singapore's response as the most firm. You talked about the fact that Singapore has imposed a range of financial sanctions on Moscow for the first time, international sanctions authorized by Singapore. Other ASEAN countries, however, condemned the invasion but did not label Russia as the aggressor, while then there's others who have been relatively muted. Myanmar, of course, you point out, was the only ASEAN country to support Russia's actions, which is not surprising given that Russia was the first government to recognize the military junta after the coup in Myanmar. But clearly the responses to the Russian invasion have been quite varied throughout ASEAN. And I wonder if you could give us a sense of the views from ASEAN countries towards what we've just been discussing, which is China's positioning with regard to Ukraine. Clearly, we heard a little bit, the US and the EU, I think, are frustrated with China's stance as it tries to straddle between, maintaining that support to Russia, but also claiming important adherence to important principles. How do countries in Southeast Asia view this? Is there a similar breakdown of varied perspectives throughout ASEAN, similar to how you described in your article their response to the Russian invasion?
Thanks, Paul. That's a great question. To cut to the chase, yes, there was like varied reactions in ASEAN towards the invasion of Ukraine, but on the subject at least on the desire that there be some negotiations and mediation, I think this is when ASEAN member states will snap into ASEAN member state mode, which is they on any hotspot or any conflict, the ASEAN way kicks in, and I use it slightly tongue-in-cheek in the sense that ASEAN will call for mediation and negotiations and the cessation of hostilities as quickly as possible. But of course, ASEAN being ASEAN will say that, well, there are hard negotiations to be done, but the major powers will have to take the lead on this, simply because I don't think ASEAN has any purchase on the Ukrainian problem apart from the route to the United States General Assembly. There was a sentiment expressed by Singapore's Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan, and I think it hit the nail on the head about although ASEAN member states do not have much of a role to play given their smaller size, a lot of the ASEAN states, in fact the region will be watching China as to its response towards the Ukrainian crisis, simply because there will be channels in which what is happening in Ukraine will affect the region. And I think Tongzhao has already said that the Chinese are watching developments in Ukraine very closely, simply because they see a parallel between China and Taiwan on the Taiwan Strait. So these events will affect smaller states in the region, and they are watching it very carefully. And I would add to Tong Chiao's comment that it's not only in the Taiwan Strait, but also in two other hotspots that we see in the Indo-Pacific, and that's the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands and also the South China Sea. Yeah.
Thank you for that, William. Let me ask you a follow-up with regard to Singapore's response, fairly robust this time, first time to authorize sanctions. What do you make of Singapore's response this time? Why robust? What was the rationale and the thinking behind that? And what influence did that have, if any, on other ASEAN countries and how they responded?
I mean, again, like Sheena, I'm not privy to kind of the deliberations behind closed doors. But I think that Singapore, as being the smallest state, well, it's not, well, depends on how you define it in ASEAN. It does see it as an existential kind of threat to international stability, and as it applies to small states. So in a sense, the condemnation was not surprising, but the sanctions, according to some interlocutors that I've spoken to, came across as unexpected. But if you look at it, Singapore really needs to put its foot down, just like it's put its foot down when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990. Singapore had very strong words about that event, and also Singapore tries to play a part whenever there are issues of kind of global import, be it like the war in Iraq and of course of Afghanistan. So in that sense, Singapore's sanctions also come in the background in the context that a lot of countries, was it 144 countries, voted on that motion in the United States General Assembly, and I guess it's a good enough context for Singapore to actually effect sanctions. And I would also like to highlight the fact that in Asia alone, minus Australia, it was only Singapore, the Republic of Korea, and Japan who's actually effected sanctions on Russia, on the Ukraine issue. So that puts Singapore in rather, kind of a different company altogether.
Thank you for that. A couple of you, and I know Sheena mentioned this idea about China as a potential mediator, and we've got a question from our audience on this. Some in the international community appear to be open to this idea. Some have even encouraged it for China to play this role as mediator. The Biden administration, the U.S. in general, seems quite negative on this, given what Sheena has described as a hard lean towards Russia. China does not look neutral in any way. And it seems to be surreptitiously, in a sense, supporting Russia while claiming it wants a peaceful resolution. But the question the audience member asks is, do Chinese leaders even want to play this role? Is there the political will in China beyond the rhetorical things that we hear? Is there political will among Chinese leaders to expend real political capital and do the hard work that Sheena described of international mediation, which is often, shuttling between capitals, engaging robustly despite the political risk that is on the line. And let me turn, if I could, to Tongjiao to answer that. What's your sense of whether or not the Chinese government is even interested in playing this role, given the discussion that's out there in the international community about it?
I tend to agree with Sheena that, I think from the Chinese perspective, simply to make that gesture of wanting to help mediate. And by the way, the Chinese talking point is always China wants to help mediate together with other relevant stakeholders and the rest of the international community. So simply making that gesture, wanting to help mediate, I think from the Chinese perspective could improve China's image and mitigate some of the international pressure on China. I don't think China has the sufficient capacity or confidence in being the real, critical mediator on the ground for many reasons that were already raised. China doesn't have deep expertise in that region or local connections or real leverage and influence, at the operational level regarding relevant players. And in fact, I think this close China-Russia partnership could undermine Chinese capacity to influence Russia, because China knows Russia would be very sensitive to where China stands on this issue. If China appears to be too close to the West, China, I think, would worry, might that backfire and undermine China's valued relationship with Russia, which China spends so much time to build, so much efforts and resources to build. And for Putin, China even failed. I believe China failed to foresee Putin's eventual war plan, and China is still at this moment trying to figure out what is Putin's eventual objective and how he really plans to achieve his goals. So without even having a good understanding about China's own partners planning and thinking of bottom lines, it's really hard for China to propose something concrete on the table that would appeal to Russia and everyone else. And because Putin is also so widely, I think, looked upon, looked up to, and admired and respected here, I don't think Chinese leadership has this psychological confidence or even willingness to tell Putin or lecture Putin how you should do to manage your own strategic security interests in Europe. So for all these reasons, I think we might not expect China, playing a critical mediator role in the center of the negotiations. Thank you.
We've got a couple questions in here about Taiwan. I'll try to sort of group them together. Tongzhao, you mentioned many Chinese look at the situation in Ukraine and think about Taiwan. There was a lot of speculation prior to the invasion that Chinese leaders would be watching to see how the international community reacted and responded to Russian aggression, and would be thinking about that in the context of any potential and future plans they may have with regard to Taiwan, a potential invasion to try to take back Taiwan. I want to get a sense from all of you. I'll ask each of you on this question because it's an important one. What impact do you think the way that the crisis in Ukraine has played out has had on Chinese thinking? Has it had more of a deterrence effect, or have they taken away lessons that potentially could contribute to making a decision to do something similar with regard to Taiwan? And I'll turn first to William, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks, Paul. I believe that the Chinese will probably be trying to take as many lessons as they can from what's happening in Ukraine. Just to make a kind of a distinguishing point, I don't think we can put Ukraine and Taiwan in the same category, right? I mean, Ukraine is a sovereign and independent country, while Taiwan, has kind of a de facto independence, but it doesn't have kind of the same kind of legal standing as an independent sovereign state as the Ukraine. So to kind of play the devil's advocate, I think if China were to launch that 1 million man amphibious invasion tomorrow, I hope that it doesn't, but if it does, it's you will see the votes going on at the United Nations General Assembly being quite different from what we saw in Ukraine today. But what I have written about Taiwan is that China will probably glean the lessons from the Ukraine, what Tongzhao said about information gaps, and the kind of the way in which Russia built the context in the run-up to the 24th of February, the invasion, on kind of a very controversial historical pretext, the use of kind of build-up of forces and of course using kind of fabricated pretext for an invasion of Taiwan, and I think that would be quite worrying for this region, because Taiwan is of course one of the hot spots in the region, and I like what I said earlier, it doesn't only apply to Taiwan itself, but it applies to other hotspots in the region as well, be it the East China Sea and the South China Sea, and China will probably be watching very closely what Russia has done on fabricated pretext, salami slicing, the use of little red men in this case, so that's certainly a cause for concern.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Sheena and then Tongjiao.
Yeah, one of the things that's been striking to me is that Chinese discourse on Ukraine has taken pains. There have been, a couple of commentaries in official media outlets and statements from diplomats, been very clear about trying to differentiate Taiwan from Ukraine. And I do think there are some really important differences. But in going back over the February 4th statement, I was actually struck by one particular line that I think might be worth dwelling on because of some of the framing that is similar, and then I'll get to the differences. So the key sentence is, Russia and China stand against attempts by external forces to undermine security and stability in their common adjacent regions, intend to counter interference by outside forces in the internal affairs of sovereign countries under any pretext, oppose color revolutions, and will increase cooperation in the aforementioned areas. So you can read that sentence both in the aftermath of Ukraine and think about its application to Russia's, adjacent regions, but also think about that with respect to Taiwan and Beijing's maritime adjacent regions, to use the phrase in the joint statement. So, I think it's too early to say. We haven't seen objectively signs from Chinese publications or outlets on exactly what the lessons will be. I think the lessons will largely depend on how this ends, and I don't think we have a clear sense of the end game yet. And I think the United States and Western analysts or global analysts need to be very careful that we don't assume that Beijing is learning the same lessons that we think we're learning, right? So I think we actually do need to read objectively what Chinese analysts and scholars and sources are saying, and to try to figure it out. And we just haven't seen a lot of that source material that we would normally look to generate that understanding. I do think, that both Taipei and Beijing will be trying to draw lessons about the military conflict. What was it that has made Ukraine more resilient than expected? What are the implications for civilian evacuation or resupply if you don't have Poland across a land border, but you have a maritime environment? I think there are potential lessons for nuclear policy that are going to probably impact any number of countries' lessons. And, there are lessons on the political, the international, the diplomatic level. How do you think about the effect of sanctions, both potentially used by Beijing itself, but also a way of protecting yourself in advance from some of the types of sanctions that have been new to this particular conflict and the international response to that conflict. So, I think there are a lot of potential lessons to learn, but I guess I wanted to just put this cautionary note out in the public that it's a little bit too early to know what those lessons will be, and we need to be very sure that we're not imposing our view of lessons learned onto Chinese thinking, because I just and I'd be curious what Tongjiao thinks of this, because I think sometimes we've tended to assume that everybody learns the same lessons when that's not in fact the case.
Very important point. Tongjiao, let me turn to you, and let me just mention also that I've seen writing that talks about this reignited debate within Taiwan about military conscription, lawmakers coming together to consider return to conscription. A sense of Taiwan really needs to think more about its own defense. And many point to that as a potentially a positive development coming out of this. But how do you see the situation from China?
Firstly, I think there is recognition that the Ukraine war is exacerbating some of the domestic challenges and difficulties China is facing today, including the wide, the very significant economic consequences for China due to the sanctions on Russia and the secondary impact on China. President Xi said, when he had this video call with President Biden a few days ago, he said, we are already facing such difficult situations today. I think he was referring to these growing domestic challenges, including in the economic area. So I think because of the recognition of growing economic challenges and the growing and the priority in China to maintain a very stable domestic situation in the run-up to the 20th Party Congress, this is a top priority for President Xi. So I think the near-term risk of any Chinese deliberate effort to take advantage of the Ukraine war and do something militarily against Taiwan is much lower than before, if there was a significant risk to start with. I think this war is making China reflect on some of its assumptions about a military operation against Taiwan. I think many Chinese strategists have assumed China could achieve a quick military success. And they assumed there will be lack of local resistance in Taiwan. They believe that Taiwanese people, if Chinese military can create a quick a new status quo, Chinese people would accept it because of the prospect of China being able to provide them, or allowing them to maintain a good living standards because of China's growing economic power, etc. China assumed that international support wouldn't be so strong and so substantial. China assumed, I think, its military superiority will be decisive vis-a-vis Taiwan. But the Ukraine war actually revealed many aspects of how new military technologies and the new military tactics are really making a big difference on the battlefield. Many of these aspects haven't been fully reviewed yet. So there needs time to evaluate such impact. And there's also the Chinese assumption that for China to take over Taiwan in a military manner would actually help China's rise, because that would demonstrate to the international community that China not only has the capacity, but the resolve to defend its own core national interests, and that should win China international respect and help the international community eventually accept China as a new international power and a leader. But I think all these assumptions are now being reflected upon. So I think the consequence is China is likely to pay more attention to its conventional wisdom, which is to buy time and to use this peaceful period to further accumulate its power and further shift the balance of power in the Asia-Pacific to China's advantage. And by that time, there probably will be no need to launch a violent military operation. The recently discussed, the recently emerged sense of urgency, China seems to want to resolve Taiwan issue in the foreseeable future, does not come from the general public, does not necessarily come from the policy elites. It appears to come from the top leadership's personal preference and the will to establish historical legacy. So I think this influence may decrease, and we may go back to the conventional wisdom of focusing on shifting the balance of power in a long-term manner. So the good news is, I think, near-term risk of military conflict is lower, but longer-term competition at the military level, that risk is growing.
Intensify. Terrific. Thank you for that. Sheena, I think, had a two-finger Did you want to add something, Sheena?
Oh, just to agree with what Tong Zhao had just said, that I think the short-term effect will be to basically wait and see how this affects the balance of resolve and capabilities and the overall context in the Indo-Pacific and across the Taiwan Strait. I should have started with that point before jumping to the longer-term lessons point, but because there was some initial discussion about whether there would be an opportunistic attempt to take advantage of the crisis. My sense is that it much more that the Beijing will wait and see, because there's a significant possibility that in the medium to long term, this could sort of alter American policymaking to their benefit.
We've just got a few minutes left, and we've got some questions from the audience. Sheena, while I have your attention, I'll ask one from Harry Zoden, coming in from Vienna. Normally Harvey. Normally Harvey is in Beijing, but he's in Vienna. His question is, and I'll direct this to Sheena: is the U.S. fighting on two fronts? And I presume he means both with Russia and China. Wise, and should the Biden team try to use this opportunity with Ukraine to do a partial reset with China where its national interests overlap?
Yeah, great question. I do think that this is going to test the United States' ability to use a very colloquial expression that my children like, walk and chew gum at the same time. The world is not going to stop because there's a particular crisis in a particular place, and that's the issue with being, a great power of the kind that the United States is, that the diplomatic and national security team is going to have to be able to deal capably with more than one issue at once. In terms of trying to use this opportunity as a reset, I think we've seen some of that. I think we've seen at least some signals, and my sense is that maybe there's been some debate on this, but that there's been some suggestion that the United States should at least find out if China is willing to redefine its interests in ways that might have more overlap with the United States. But in order to do that partial reset, I think you need potentially more momentum or more movement coming from Beijing than we've seen. And the reality is, just in a democracy, in a midterm election year, it's going to be very difficult to sell what could be perceived as softer policies on Beijing in a moment when Chinese rhetoric is, been particularly prone to identifying the United States and NATO as the culprit, right? There's just a sort of rhetorical domestic politics strategy mismatch there. So regardless of kind of the should question, it's just very hard for me to see how you could thread that particular needle absent more movement from Beijing itself.
Thank you. One for Tong Zhao, and William will get the last question of the evening or the morning, depending on where you are in the world. For Tong Zhao, coming in from Maciek Rozowski, does China worry about a potential destructive impact from the conflict in Ukraine on the Belt and Road Initiative?
Given that I'm not an economic issue expert, I will give a short answer. I think, based on my discussion with Chinese colleagues, I think there is a lot of concern in that regard. Ukraine is a very important hub, local hub, regional hub for China's Belt and Road projects in that part of the world. It connects China with other places. The land transportation from China to Europe goes through Ukraine for a large part. So given what is happening, given all the major infrastructures, including many China-funded infrastructure projects destroyed in the war, given the how long this entire thing can drag on and have continuous and increasingly broader geoeconomic impact, I think China is worried about its potentially huge impact on China's Belt and Road Initiative.
Thank you for that. And William, you're going to get the last question of the evening. It's a big one, and you've got just a short period of time to answer it. But we mentioned the 50th anniversary of Nixon's visit to China, February 1972, which initiated the era of U.S. China diplomatic normalization. As we look now at what appears to be an inflection point for U.S. China relations, what's your most important recommendation and what the U.S. and China can do to better manage the relationship going forward in a way that is beneficial to the region, including Southeast Asia, where you are?
Yeah, thanks for that. Got 90 seconds, Paul. I think I agree with Sheena and I agree with Tong Zhao that the best gift that China and the United States can give to states in the region is, of course, working on that guardrails kind of terminology, or what Thomas Schelling actually talked about, focal points, resting places that, despite the intense competition that's happening between China and the United States, try to look for some fire breaks, try to look for some areas in which you can cooperate. And from our discussions at the least, I think if China were to expend some political capital on the Ukraine issue, I think that would earn it some brownie points in the region. In the South China Sea, if there could be some agreement that there needs to be some way forward, or at least limiting some of the escalatory tensions in the region, in that maritime area, it would help. The same applies to Taiwan, because I understand the Chinese when they say that Washington, despite having a one China policy, doesn't seem to be acting out that one China policy in terms of sending troops for training on Taiwan itself. So if there could, it's theoretically difficult, but if you can find these resting places, I think it would at least answer Harvey's question about finding a reset in China-US relations, even as what is happening in Ukraine is happening. Yeah.
Thank you, William. Some important responses there. And I want to thank all of you, Sheena, Tong Zhao, William, for a terrific discussion on U.S.-China relations and the recent crisis with Ukraine. I want to thank our listeners. I want to thank the Carnegie China team for putting this together. We have two dialogues left this spring, China-Europe next month, and then beyond that, we'll do China-Middle East. And so we look forward to seeing you back here again. Thanks again to all our participants. Have a great evening or a great morning, rest of the morning, wherever you are in the world. Thanks again, and see you soon.